Today's roundtable discussion delves a lot deeper on the issue of cybersecurity and a whole lot more. We're lucky to be joined by Riaz Raihan, the president of Alida, and Sweeney Williams, the VP of Alida and head of security compliance. And also we have Carl Doty, the principal at Atlaas, joining us back again. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us today.
Pleasure to be here.
For having me.
Thank you for reconvening this is really an existing conversation we've taken to a new format and hopefully a whole new level. But I wanted to jump right in on some of the headlines that we're publishing and talking about right now. In fact, we just published one that had to do with the basic root causes of hacks and other security issues. The data point to the simplest issues. It's either employee negligence, which you would think could be fairly fixable, and weak passwords. But Sweeney and Riaz, you both come from a world that operates on a much more sophisticated level than that. I'm really interested to hear, one, how you coordinate sophisticated systems to deliver the kind of security that you need to. But I think the other side of that is providing the real and perceived sense of security to your customers, because there's the reality, and I think then there's the perceived reality. So, and Sweeney, this is right up your alley. So I'm just gonna point to you and say, enlighten us.
Reality or perceived reality. I think that the simplest answer to that is we work with enterprise customers, right? So we work with brands. We don't work directly with consumers. We provide a platform that lets our brands interact with their own consumers. But one of the things that brands are responsible for, and you see as kind of a common practice now, a few years ago, maybe it was only best of breed brands were doing this type of thing, is brands do their due diligence, right? So if a brand is gonna come and purchase a platform like the platform Alida provides, they're gonna come in and they're gonna kick the tires, they're going to they're going to look under the hood. They're going to ask a lot of questions, and they're going to come to their own decisions on whether or not we're providing an adequate platform for their needs in terms of the security and privacy controls that we have in place. So when we have those interactions with companies, a lot of times they're asking for the things that you would expect, right? Are we encrypting data at rest and encrypting it in transit? Are we hardening systems? Are we ensuring that there are, segregation of corporate operations and production operations in place? And they're also not going to actually take our word for it. They're also going to want to know that we've had a third party come in and assess us and validate that we're actually doing those things. So we are, we're third party audited, and we help provide that assurance. So I think that's kind of the foundation of how brands interact with us and ensure that we're doing all of the things that they require of us, right? And when you think about what a company is really doing when they're working with a company like Alida or any other third party, they're effectively increasing or extending their perimeter, right? So now they're responsible for what happens in this third-party system that is processing their data, and there's kind of a flow-down effect there. So that due diligence is something that companies are mandated to do by law, by regulation, and when all else fails, it is a best practice because they effectively become responsible for some part of that extended perimeter.
I was curious if you could share what kind of variability you see at Alida about from client to client or from industry to industry on their privacy or compliance and security requirements. Are you seeing more standardization across that landscape, or is it still really, really highly variable?
That's a great question. Of late, and when I say of late, I would say over the last 2 years or so, we've seen those kind of validation programs become more and more similar, right? A few years ago, we would see that heavily regulated industries would have these very robust programs to validate the security of a vendor, and then you would engage with maybe a smaller organization or maybe more of a tech forward organization and they just really want the product, and they didn't have such robust controls and questions. I've found that over the last couple of years, we've really seen a lot of standardization. And when I say standardization, one of the things that leads to that is there are third-party organizations out there that actually provide kind of standardized questionnaires that a company can use to just send to another organization and find out about their security privacy practices. So we're seeing some of that standardization resulting from use of those tools. But I also have this opinion. I've used this in the past, that nowadays there's not really any new security questions. So if you've seen a couple of questionnaires and you're at one organization, you'll probably reuse those, like those types of things. So we're seeing a lot of that. But the most common thing that we're seeing is that companies understand the value and the importance of third-party attestation reports, right? Like SOC 2 audit reports, or third-party certifications, those types of things. And they're requesting those even if they ask the other questions. They still want that validation to come along with your responses. So we're seeing a lot of standardization there.
There's two elements to how we address this. One is what I call structural, and the other is ethical. The structural, I think, it addresses the letter of the law, but the ethical goes after the spirit of the law.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's enough to just meet the letter of the law and says, yeah, you set the bar here, we are like 1 millimeter above it, so we are done. I think you have to go well beyond it. So when we design products, especially with AI doesn't have a soul. AI does whatever you tell it to do. There is no morality in AI. And I think it's our job to infuse that sense of, not morality, but I call it binary computing morality. So it stays within what it's supposed to stay, and it doesn't become creepy. Because we're capturing a lot of data about customers on behalf of our customers. So our clients are big companies around the world, but they have millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of consumers and customers, regular people like you and I who consume these products and services, right? And we're capturing a lot of data about them, either directly through surveys, indirectly through social media, or we are inferring things about them based on their behavior. You did this, therefore you will now do this. That's inferring. That's a lot of responsibility. There's a lot of responsibility, and AI can go crazy with that, and it can do lots of things which can be creepy and intrusive. So I think it's very important, and we take that very seriously. Empathy is one of our core values, and we never want to be intrusive because that is not empathetic. So from an engineering standpoint, we're not just trying to meet the letter of the law, we're trying to get to the spirit of the law.
So two questions that I think you just prompted, Riaz, and the first is, how do you do that? How do you build in morality or some sort of ethical guidelines? Because ultimately that comes down to human input and human values. I mean, how do you manage that at scale?
There's 2 or 3 ways to do that, right? But 2 or 3 ways that we use how to do that. Number one, we build in a lot of controls. We call them toggles. There's a lot of controls that are already built into the system. So when a customer unwraps it and starts using our artificial intelligence, we very clearly lay out the intentionality of accepting that. It's not buried inside a 300-word or 3,000-word essay, and it's like in paragraph number 14. Nobody reads those. They just scroll down, they say, go on. We are very intentional and deliberate about making sure that they know what they're doing. I think that's very important, right? That's step one. Step two is the toggles. You got to make it, they have to consciously turn things on and not just a default setting. That's very important. And step three, there have to be checks and balances that we bake into the system. We have a rule engine that builds in the checks and balances so that even before something, even potentially or vaguely creepy is done, that the client knows that this could have an intrusive impact. For example, if you capture something that someone has said on social media and you pair that up with what they said in the survey, now you have a piece of data and you want to do a future survey on them. And that survey has a next level of questions which assumes that you've already heard what they said on social media. If you didn't know that this was happening, it could be creepy. So if Mike gets a follow-on survey that said, hey, Mike, you tweeted this, can we help solve this problem? Mike might say, I never asked you to listen to my, even though it's public information. Those are the kind of rules that we build in so that it's very intentional. I think the intentionality makes it more acceptable as opposed to just doing it without that intentionality.
So you've got basically the controls, the toggles there, and they're, as if I'm paraphrasing here, but it sounds like you basically set them to off and they must be actively set to on. on a client by client, situation by situation basis. That's really interesting. And I just wanted to, I just want to follow on.
Can I dive in there?
Yeah, please do.
I've got a question about that. This is a fascinating topic for me. While I was at Forrester, I was running a team of a lot of analysts covering advanced analytics and artificial intelligence. And one of the topics that always fascinated me was the ethics of AI itself. And the subject that we tried to tackle, and probably are still trying to tackle since I've left, is this notion of building the models and training the models inside the AI engine, if you will, and the implicit bias that can be introduced by the very people that build them or by the data that you're using to train those models. So I'm curious if you have some thoughts about how to overcome that as a business.
I think you're now getting into the realm of machine learning a little bit, which is kind of closely related to AI. The way we design machine learning models, you're right, there's a lot of bias that goes into machine learning models. And research has shown that the bias is directly linked to who wrote those models. So I think it's important to have, a diverse group of people. As an example, 50% of the people on the planet are female, right? I'm stating the obvious. But are 50% of the people writing the ML models female? Most companies would say probably not, right? Unless you introduce that, you're going to have that bias. It might not be intentional bias.
Right.
However, it does creep in. The other thing is, we want to have people from a diverse range of racial backgrounds. You want to have people that represent different forms of just different ways of thought. We need the LGBTQ community represented. You need people from different parts of the world. You need people who think in different languages, not necessarily people who all think in English or all think in Spanish, right? You need people who think in different languages. So all of this is what we try to do. So we try to have a very diverse group. As an example, we intentionally recruited people with as much of all these diversity factors that I just mentioned into our AI group. Our AI group is about 20 people, which is about 10% of my overall engineering organization. And that group, we went above and beyond to bring that in because of exactly what you just said. Because I think that's how you address bias at source, because those people are thinking differently. As an example, a couple of the guys on the team grew up in Asia, right? One grew up in Korea, the other grew up in China. They're very different countries. They're very different countries. They bring that into how we write ML models. Someone grew up in Eastern Europe. Someone else grew up in Western Europe. Someone grew up in the US. A couple of them, a couple of them grew up in Canada. So we've got that diversity on all those factors. And at source, you can address bias through that. That's number one. Number two is testing. Testing. You have to test it, and you have to compare the results, and you have to constantly improve on the model.
So Riaz, are you talking about that? Are you talking about AI as marketing technology at this point? Or are you talking about it as cybersecurity?
I'm talking about it primarily as customer experience. So it's customer service,
Okay.
Customer experience, a little bit of marketing. But of course, remember, Rafer, all of this is underpinned from a cybersecurity standpoint, because we are capturing a lot of data from different sources. We call it omni-channel, which is a nice way of saying multiple sources of capturing data. So maintaining the data integrity and security is paramount. And that's where Sweeney comes in.
And so, and I'm going to take it back to Sweeney. So, you talk about how machine learning and AI evolving and being more empathetic and less creepy. I want cybersecurity that's really creepy. I want you cutting everything off. I mean, right? So, Sweeney, how does hackers are constantly evolving in their methods. So, can you give us a little window and insight to how cybersecurity has to evolve? I imagine it's along similar lines as what Riaz was describing for the CX.
Yeah, I think that if we're looking at security as it relates to the types of products that Alida builds, right? We don't build security products, right? There are wonderful companies who do great things with AI to determine what a baseline secure situation looks like, and goes and does things to protect your system when things deviate from those baselines. But for us and companies like us, I think the types of things that we need to be cognizant of are how do we approach doing something new, right? How do we securely approach doing something like building new models, building a novel product that we think our customers are going to love? And I think a lot of businesses are struggling with this, because the thing that most people do is they hear that, well, their competitors are doing this, and therefore they need to do it as well, and they rush to go and do that thing. And when people rush, they forget to do the basic things that they should be doing, right? So hey, we need to build this model. Let's not reach out to our IT team to have them build a secure system for us to use for this, and let's not figure out a safe way to get a data set that we're allowed to use. Let's go use our credit card. Let's go to a cloud service that I know does this type of stuff. Let's get as much data as we can and throw it in there, and let's build our models, and our customers will love it, right? And in reality, it's the same as anything else. You need to use secure systems, right? So you need production grade systems that have production controls around them when you are building your systems or spinning up your systems that are going to do that data crunching. You need to make sure that only the people who should have access to those systems and that data have that access, right? So access controls and authorization, all those things are very, very important. And when we talk about the data set, you want to avoid at all costs a situation where, well, your data science team is doing really, really important stuff that your customers are going to love, so they have a right to all of the data that you collect. Well, that absolutely not, right? So you need a permission data set that complies with what you've promised to your either to your direct customer or to your consumers, that keeps data in the jurisdiction that they agreed to, and that you're using it for the purposes that they consented to, and that you're deleting that data when you no longer need it. Like all those things that you're supposed to be doing as a data best practice, that still applies here, right? So the rules don't change, but what we find with people is that they rush to do the next big thing, and they think that all the rules go out the window. That doesn't apply to them. They have to go and do this new thing. And when we saw the rise of big data in the 2000s, and what did companies do, right? Companies collected as much data as they could from as many sources as they could, thinking that that was the way to grow their business, and the way to improve everything and personalize and all those things. Well, there was a lot of harm that happened, right? You had companies with massive data sets on people who had no idea that these companies had these data sets, and that data was getting breached, and that data was getting traded, and it was creeping people out. And the result of that we see many years on is we have GDPR, we have CCPA and CPRA that's coming after it, right? So all of those things, those are regulatory and societal reactions to companies thinking they need to rush to do something and not doing it the right way, right? So that to me, I think that's kind of the biggest challenge that companies have, is taking a step back, slowing down a little bit, and doing the right things the right way, and doing the right things by their customers.
I want to maybe sidestep that one for a moment, and because I think there are a handful of conversations that you as providers, and Carl and Sweeney and Riaz, I think you can all speak to this from a different angle, but when you're talking to the brands, the users of these technologies, do you have a sense that privacy and security are genuine concerns versus are they the concerns of the moment? They kind of float through the news cycle. And I guess along with that question, do you have a sense that this is basically a CIO's responsibility, and it's his problem, her problem, and once they take care of it, it's handled? Or do you feel like the scope of potential harm that can be done has permeated the C-suite to a place where you can see genuine action?
Sorry, Riaz, go ahead.
I think all three of us probably have some thoughts on this.
Why don't we go alphabetical? Carl, you go.
All right. I was just going to say, I think, and like your examples, it's more the latter today. I think it's very real. I think the C-suite takes it very seriously, but I'd say as recently as 5 years ago, that wasn't the case, right? Having covered the MarTech space for the better part of the last decade or so, I remember the world not so long ago where marketers were all about whatever data they can grab on consumers and using it to be as personalized and contextual as possible in their campaigns or in their touch points across different channels. And today, that's a very different scenario. It's a very scary scenario in some circumstances because everybody's afraid of not just being compliant with regulations, but being too creepy for their customers, and frankly, facing financial fines that they've seen very large organizations in Europe and the US, frankly, for things like data breaches. So it's a very serious concern today.
Yeah, I'd like to give a perspective by an industry, a kind of an industry lens, right? So I'll pick on 5 big industries that we serve, right? If you look at healthcare, I give them a 5-star, 5 out of 5. They're obsessed with it. They're obsessed with it to the point where it'll actually hamper, processes, but they don't care. They will take a security first point of view to hell with.
Well, and HIPAA's decades old, right? Yes.
And they will take that very seriously, right? Even the tiniest thing. I'll give you an example. One spouse should not know what's happening with the other spouse's health records because that would be a breach of confidentiality. Even something that close. Then there's financial services. I would give them 4 stars, 4 out of 5. They really, really care because they obviously want to avoid fraud, and it's an industry which attracts a lot of hackers and fraudsters and so on because there's money to be made. And I give them a 4.5 stars. And then there's retail, tech, and media. I'd give them maybe between 3 and 4 stars. I think they want to make sure that they avoid the fines and the penalties, but maybe not as obsessed with it as healthcare and financial services. However, I'm giving you kind of the state of the nation from my perspective. However, they're all moving upwards in the sense they all want to get to more stars. Nobody is staying stagnant or moving downwards. I think everyone realizes that there has to be more investment and to get to a better place on all fronts. Sweeney?
Yeah, I agree with all the points that were stated. When I think about whether this is genuine or whether it's kind of forced, we want to avoid fines, those types of things. I think that it's genuine because if companies don't do it, they do face those fines, but then there's a competitive advantage that their competitors gain if their competitors kind of have the trust of their customers.
Yep.
And this company doesn't, right? So you're kind of forced to do the right things. Doesn't mean you're doing the wrong thing. It doesn't really matter why you're doing it. What's most important is that you're doing it. But trust is a real thing nowadays, right? And companies genuinely care about retaining their customers and having the look and feel of a brand that is always doing the right things and is not surprising its customers. And if GDPR fines are the reason that you're doing that, that's absolutely fine. If your competitor is really good at this thing and they're taking market share because they're great at the trust thing, and that's why you're doing it now, that's perfectly fine as well. At the end of the day, as long as the consumer wins, I think that we're all happy.
Gentlemen, this has been a fascinating conversation. We could all talk about this for a lot longer, but Carl Doty, Riaz Raihan, and Sweeney Williams, thank you all so much for joining us today.